Russians and Ukrainians often point to the same medieval kingdom, the same capital, the same princes, the same churches, the same old story. But today, they can tell almost opposite versions of what that story means. For the Russian state, the shared past is often used as evidence that Russia and Ukraine belong to one historical world. For Ukrainians, that same past is often part of a very different argument, that Ukraine is not a mistake, not an invention, and not a province waiting to return. It is a nation whose independence matters. So if Russia and Ukraine share so much history, why do they understand that history so differently? That is the missing context. And it matters now because this is not only a war over land. As of August 2026, Ukraine is still living through Russia's full-scale war. UN human rights monitors have reported sharply rising civilian casualties in the first half of 2026. NATO has also reaffirmed large-scale military support for Ukraine. Missiles, drones, trenches, sanctions, and alliances shape the war. But so do older arguments. Who belongs with whom? Who has the right to decide? What does Crimea mean? What did the Soviet past mean? And is Ukraine a sovereign nation, or part of a larger Russian historical space? To understand why those questions still carry so much force, you have to start with a place both stories care about deeply: Kyiv. Long before there was a modern Russian state or a modern Ukrainian state, there was Kyivan Rus. It was a medieval East Slavic polity centered on Kyiv. It connected trade routes, dynasties, religion, and power across a wide region of Eastern Europe. For later Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, Kyivan Rus became a shared historical inheritance. That is exactly why it is so politically powerful. But here is the part that often gets lost. Kyivan Rus was not modern Russia. It was not modern Ukraine either. Those states did not exist yet. So the question is not, who owns Kyivan Rus? That is the wrong question. The better question is, why did a shared medieval past become evidence in two modern national stories? The answer begins with what happened after that world broke apart. When Mongol power devastated Kyiv in the 13th century, the old political center weakened. Different regions moved through different historical paths. Moscow rose in the northeast. Many Ukrainian lands passed through Lithuanian, Polish-Lithuanian, Cossack, Russian Imperial, Habsburg, and later Soviet worlds. That sounds like a lot of names, but the basic point is simple. Shared origin did not mean shared political experience. Over time, people who could look back to the same medieval past lived under different rulers, different institutions, and different pressures. That is where the story starts to split. For Russia's later imperial story, Kyiv and the lands around it could be absorbed into a larger narrative of Russian civilization. For Ukrainian national memory, those same centuries could look different, a history of local identity developing under outside rule. One way to see that is language. Language is not only grammar. In an empire, language can become power. By the 19th century, Ukrainian writers, poets, teachers, and activists were helping turn local speech and culture into a modern national identity. They wrote, they published, they collected songs and stories. They argued that Ukrainian was not just a peasant dialect, it was part of a living culture. The Russian Empire often saw that differently. In 1863, imperial authorities restricted major Ukrainian language, religious, and educational publications. In 1876, another decree went further, restricting Ukrainian language publishing, imports, public readings, theater, and lyrics. Those rules did not erase Ukrainian identity, but they show why language became political. To imperial authorities, Ukrainian cultural revival could look like a threat. To Ukrainians, those restrictions became proof that their identity had to be defended. This is one of the central patterns of the episode. The same fact can enter two stories in opposite ways. Russia's imperial story could frame Ukrainian distinctiveness as regional, provincial, or dangerous. Ukraine's national story could frame imperial pressure as evidence that a real identity was being constrained. Then came the Soviet period, and here the story becomes even more complicated, because Soviet Ukraine was not simply erased. It had a republic, it had borders, it had institutions, it had a name on the map, but it did not have full sovereignty. The Soviet Union recognized republics on paper, while real power remained centralized through the Communist Party. That created a paradox. Modern Ukraine inherited some of its state shape from the Soviet Union. But many Ukrainians also remember Soviet rule through repression, famine, Russification, and trauma. The hardest example is the Holodomor. In 1932 and 1933, millions died in the Soviet famine in Ukraine. For Ukraine, the Holodomor is a central national trauma. Ukraine and many other states recognize it as genocide. Russia rejects that framing, and historians still debate how to describe intention, targeting, and the wider Soviet famine. So the responsible way to say it is this: the mass death is not in question. Its meaning is fiercely contested. For Ukrainian memory, the Holodomor is not just a tragedy in the countryside. It is part of a longer story about Soviet power crushing Ukrainian life. For Russian official memory, that interpretation is often rejected as an anti-Russian political reading of a broader Soviet disaster. Again, the same past does not produce one meaning. World War II adds another layer. For the Soviet Union, and later for the Russian state, victory over Nazi Germany became one of the most sacred stories of modern identity. And Ukraine was deeply part of that war. Ukrainians fought in the Red Army. Ukraine was occupied and devastated. Cities were destroyed. Millions died. But the memory is not simple. For some, the Soviet victory means liberation and sacrifice. For others, especially in parts of Ukraine with different wartime experiences, the story also includes occupation, collaboration, resistance, deportation, and the return of Soviet control. That does not make either memory false. It means the Soviet past is heavy enough to hold more than one experience. Then there is Crimea. In 1954, Crimea was transferred from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Inside the Soviet Union, this was an internal transfer. It did not create an international border crisis at the time, because both republics were inside the same state. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, that internal line became part of an international border. Now that is why Crimea matters so much later. For Russia, Crimea could be framed as a historical territory, wrongly separated by a Soviet administrative decision. For Ukraine, Crimea became part of the internationally recognized state that emerged in 1991. And 1991 is the next decisive moment. When the Soviet Union was collapsing, Ukraine declared independence. Then Ukrainians voted on it. The result was overwhelming. More than 90% of voters nationwide supported independence. And that support was not only in western Ukraine. Every region voted yes. Crimea and Sevastopol also voted majority yes, though by lower margins than the national average. This is why 1991 matters so much in the Ukrainian story. It is not only a legal date, it is a democratic anchor. It says Ukraine did not merely drift out of the Soviet Union. It chose independence. But 1991 did not settle the meaning of the relationship for everyone. Legally, Ukraine became a sovereign state. Internationally, it was recognized. But politically and emotionally, some Russian leaders and thinkers never fully accepted Ukraine as permanently separate from Russia's historical space. That tension grew after independence. Ukraine tried to build a state with multiple languages, regions, memories, and political directions. Some Ukrainians looked toward Europe. Some had deep cultural and family ties to Russia. Many had both. That complexity matters. Ukraine was not one simple anti-Russian project. It was a diverse country trying to define itself after empire and after the Soviet Union. For Russia's leadership, especially under Vladimir Putin, that same process was increasingly described in darker terms. Ukraine's movement toward Western institutions was framed as outside interference. NATO became central to the Russian security story. Russian officials also spoke about protecting Russian speakers and resisting Ukrainian nationalism. In 2021, Putin published an essay arguing for the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. That essay matters because it shows history being used as politics. It was not just a reflection on the past. It was an argument about the present. In that argument, Ukraine's separateness looked artificial, dangerous, or Western-made. In the Ukrainian argument, that same language sounded like imperial denial, a refusal to accept that Ukraine had its own political will. That brings the story to 2014. After months of protest in Kyiv, Ukraine's pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych left power. Russia then seized and annexed Crimea. War began in Donbass. Russia described Crimea's move as self-determination. Ukraine and most of the international community described it as annexation. The United Nations General Assembly affirmed Ukraine's territorial integrity and said the Crimea referendum could not form the basis for changing Crimea's status. This is where the historical argument became territorial rupture. Crimea was not only a peninsula, it became a test of which story would shape reality: Russia's story of historical correction, or Ukraine's story of violated sovereignty. And then came 2022. Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Putin's public justification again used security language, NATO, Donbass, Russian speakers, and claims about Ukraine's political direction. The UN General Assembly said Russia's aggression violated the UN Charter and demanded withdrawal. From the Ukrainian view, the invasion confirmed the central fear: that Russia did not accept Ukraine as a real sovereign nation. From the Russian state view, the war was framed as defensive, historical, and strategic. Those claims are not equivalent under international law. But the episode is not asking you to miss the legal difference. It is asking you to see why history became part of the conflict itself. Because once history becomes a weapon, every map becomes more than a map. Ukraine's capital is not only a capital. Crimea is not only a peninsula. Language is not only language. The Soviet past is not only memory. Each one becomes evidence in a larger argument over legitimacy. That is why this war feels so deep. It is fought over territory. It is fought over security. It is fought over power. But it is also fought over who gets to define the past. And that is why the simple explanations fail. It is not true that Russia and Ukraine were always separate strangers. They were not. Their histories are deeply connected. But it is also not true that shared history means they must be one country. Shared history can produce closeness. It can also produce conflict when one side treats that closeness as a claim of authority, and the other treats independence as the only protection from it. That is the missing context. Russia and Ukraine share a past, but they do not share one meaning of that past. And once sovereignty, empire, security, and identity collided, history itself became part of the war. If you like my content, please like and follow for more.